Every country on Earth is buried in debt. The United States carries $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. And the world as a whole? A staggering $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the entire global economy. But here's the paradox almost nobody understands. If every nation is drowning in debt, who's the creditor? Who's the one being paid? The answer is not a mysterious empire, not a hidden cabal, not a foreign power. The world owes money to itself. But this circular system didn't emerge naturally. It wasn't an accident, nor a consequence of modern complexity. It was designed, refined, and perfected by 4 men across 3 centuries, 4 moments in history when banking, government, and power fused into something permanent. They didn't create a conspiracy. They created infrastructure, legal, documented, publicly recorded mechanisms that still operate today. Each architect solved a problem of their century, and each solution tightened the same loop. Debt should not expire. Debt should not clear. Debt should feed the system forever. And once you understand how this mechanism evolved, you stop seeing $38 trillion as a crisis. You recognize it for what it is, the system working exactly as intended. The first architect, William Paterson, 1694. Before 1694, kings borrowed money like gamblers on a bad streak. They went to merchants, nobles, or powerful families and promised repayment with interest. Loans were personal. If a king defaulted, as they often did, the creditors lost money and the cycle reset. Debt cleared through collapse. Then came William Paterson, a Scottish merchant with a mind sharpened by failure and ambition. England was locked in war with France. King William III was desperate. Taxation couldn't sustain the war, and lenders refused new loans because England had defaulted more than once. Paterson stepped forward with a proposal so radical it would become the blueprint for modern finance, a loan that would never be repaid. He rallied a group of wealthy merchants willing to lend the government £1.2 million, around $300 million today. In exchange, they would receive 8% interest every year, indefinitely. No principal repayment, no end date. A perpetual annuity backed by the full power of Parliament's taxation. To manage this arrangement, Paterson proposed creating a new institution, the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. Merchants deposited their gold into the new bank. The bank loaned the gold to the government. The government paid annual interest from taxes. The merchants received tradable banknotes in return. Those banknotes were more than receipts. They were currency, backed not by gold, but by government debt. And here was the key innovation. The government's IOU became money. The more the government borrowed, the more the bank could issue notes. The more notes it issued, the more the economy depended on the debt. The more the system expanded, the more impossible it became to unwind it. Debt was no longer a temporary burden. Debt became the foundation of the monetary system. By the time Paterson died in 1719, he was not particularly wealthy, but the architecture he built endured for more than 3 centuries. British national debt has never been paid off. It has only been rolled over, expanded, refinanced exactly as the system was designed. And other nations copied it quickly. France, the Netherlands. And in 1790, under Alexander Hamilton, the United States adopted the same model. A model where governments borrow forever, where taxpayers fund perpetual interest, and where the principal is never, ever repaid. By the early 1800s, Europe had embraced government borrowing, but the process was chaotic. Each loan had to be negotiated individually. Rates differed wildly. Participation was limited to a handful of elite merchants. There was no unified market, no system, no liquidity. Nathan Rothschild changed everything. The Rothschild family began as humble money changers in Frankfurt. But by 1800, the five Rothschild brothers had established an unprecedented banking network across Europe, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples, a financial web that could move capital across borders faster than any government. Nathan Rothschild, operating from London, was the strategic mastermind. During the Napoleonic Wars, he financed Britain's war effort, but not through simple lending. His innovation was to transform government borrowing into a mass consumer product. Instead of lending directly to governments, Rothschild began buying their bonds at a discount and then reselling them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market, a liquid, tradable system where sovereign debt became an asset that moved through the entire financial ecosystem. Governments got money immediately. Rothschild pocketed the spread. Investors gained a stable, interest-paying asset. And the market gained something even more valuable: scalability. But Rothschild's true power was information. His courier network was faster, more reliable, and more global than any official channel in Europe. At the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Nathan learned of Napoleon's defeat before the British government itself. What he did next became legendary, often distorted in retellings, but the core truth is documented. He used that early information to control the market. First, he sold British bonds, creating the impression Britain had lost. Prices fell as investors panicked. Then, at the bottom, Rothschild quietly bought huge quantities of British debt. When official news arrived announcing victory, bond prices skyrocketed, and Rothschild made one of the greatest profits in financial history. It wasn't illegal. There were no insider trading laws. It was simply a man with faster information and a stronger network manipulating a fragile system. But the consequences were enormous. By the 1820s, the Rothschilds had become the undisputed rulers of European sovereign debt. When any government needed money, they went through the Rothschilds, not because of force, but because the Rothschilds controlled the entire distribution network. They set the terms. They controlled the investors. They influenced the markets. And here is where the trap deepened. Before Rothschild, kings could fail. If a government defaulted, lenders suffered, and the system reset. Rothschild changed the scale. Government bonds were no longer held by a small group of lenders. They were spread across Europe. A single British bond might be owned by a French banker, sold to a German investor, pledged as collateral in Austria, and then used to settle a debt in Italy. Sovereign debt became globalized and interwoven. A single default wouldn't simply hurt one creditor. It would cause bank failures, currency shocks, liquidity crises, and cross-border insolvency. Default became not just costly, it became unthinkable. Rothschild didn't need to force governments to pay. He made the system so interconnected that they couldn't afford not to. And so the trap, once merely permanent, became inescapable. Governments had to keep paying interest, keep borrowing more, keep feeding the network. The Rothschilds didn't build factories, farms, or fleets. Their empire was composed of interest payments, the steady, endless flow of sovereign debt feeding through their global financial network. By the mid-1800s, they were the richest family on earth, not by conquering nations, but by financing them. The Paterson model made debt eternal. The Rothschild model made it systemic, and every major power in Europe became dependent on it. By 1900, the United States was rising fast. Industrial output exploding, railroads spreading, corporations forming, wealth concentrating. But the financial system behind this economic giant was still primitive. There was no central authority managing money. Banks operated independently, tied to the gold supply. The system worked until it didn't. In 1907, everything broke. A stock market crash triggered bank runs across the country. Liquidity evaporated. Businesses failed. Panic swept the nation. And in that void of leadership, one man stepped forward, not a president, Not a general, but a banker. John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan personally orchestrated the rescue. He gathered the most powerful bankers in America inside his private library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge millions of their own money to stabilize the collapsing system. Whether it was heroism or self-preservation is debated. What matters is that it worked. The panic ended, the crisis stopped, and Morgan became something unthinkable for a single private citizen, the unofficial central banker of the United States. But Morgan knew the system couldn't survive another crisis. He knew he couldn't play savior forever. So he and his closest allies decided to design a replacement, an institution that would formalize what he had been doing in the shadows. The American public, however, despised central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been killed by populist outrage. So Morgan's circle needed a central bank, but they couldn't call it one. They needed something that looked decentralized and democratic, but was controlled by the financial elite. So in November 1910, a covert operation was launched. A group of bankers and politicians, Morgan's inner circle, boarded a private train under fake names and traveled to Jekyll Island, Georgia, where they spent 9 days crafting the blueprint of modern American finance. The secrecy was absolute. If the public discovered bankers were designing the national monetary system, the plan would die instantly. The result of that hidden meeting was the foundation for what would become the Federal Reserve System. Notice the language. Not the Central Bank of the United States, not the National Reserve Authority, but a Federal Reserve System, a name engineered to calm the public. It appeared decentralized. 12 regional banks scattered across the country. It appeared democratic. The president would appoint members to the board of governors, but the structure ensured private banking control. Here's how. Regional Federal Reserve banks were owned by their member banks. Those private banks purchased stock in the regional feds. Member banks elected the boards of the regional Federal Reserve banks. The regional boards elected members of the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. In other words, bankers selected the people who ran the system. And the most powerful branch, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, was dominated by Wall Street banks, including Morgan's own affiliates. It controlled open market operations, bond purchases, money creation, and the most critical power of all, acting as the primary buyer of U.S. government debt. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913. Most legislators didn't fully understand its implications. But once it passed, the entire structure of American finance transformed. Before the Fed, government borrowing was limited. Banks could only lend what they actually had. After the Fed, there was no limit. The mechanism worked like this. The U.S. Treasury issues bonds. The Federal Reserve buys them using money it creates on the spot. The government spends that money. The debt accumulates on the Fed's balance sheet. This arrangement meant something historically unprecedented. There would always be a buyer for U.S. government debt. Even if no one else wanted the bonds, the Fed would purchase them. Even if the market panicked, the Fed would step in. Even if borrowing exploded, the Fed would fund it. This is how the United States was able to build the enormous debt machine that exists today. Without the Fed, America could never owe $38 trillion because the bond market would have collapsed long ago. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was born. He didn't live to see its rise, but the system he helped design made government debt functionally infinite. The Paterson model made debt perpetual. The Rothschild model made it globalized. The Morgan model made it limitless. The trap was almost complete. By the late 1970s, the global debt system was fully built, but something threatened it. Inflation. It was destroying currencies, destabilizing governments, and shaking confidence in the entire financial order. Paul Volcker, appointed Federal Reserve Chairman in 1979, made a decision that would complete the trap. He raised interest rates to nearly 20%, the highest in U.S. history. Inflation collapsed, but so did the finances of developing nations. Countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions in the 1970s at low rates. Now their payments had tripled, and they couldn't keep up. In 1982, Mexico announced it could no longer pay its debt. Under a normal system, this would trigger defaults and force losses on the banks that lent the money. But the new global system didn't allow defaults anymore. Instead, the IMF stepped in with rescue loans. These loans didn't solve the problem. They ensured developing nations could keep paying interest to American and European banks. In exchange, the IMF required harsh conditions: spending cuts, privatization, currency devaluation, and the surrender of economic control. Volcker's model became permanent. When nations can't pay, don't forgive the debt, restructure it forever. Just enough money to avoid collapse, never enough to escape. This pattern repeated for decades. Argentina, Greece, Sri Lanka. The same result every time debt rolled over. Interest continued, sovereignty weakened. Volcker didn't invent global finance, but he cemented its final rule: debt must never be allowed to disappear. Each architect added a layer. Paterson, 1694. Debt becomes permanent. Rothschild, 1815. Debt becomes global. Morgan, 1913. Debt becomes limitless. Volcker, 1982. Debt becomes inescapable. This is why modern debt cannot be paid off. If the U.S. eliminated its $38 trillion debt, the money supply would collapse. If the world eliminated its $315 trillion debt, global trade would stop. Debt isn't a burden, it's the backbone of the monetary system. And the interest? That flows to institutions like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and major banks, those who manage and hold the bonds. For them, debt is not a crisis. It's a continuous stream of income. The final realization the system works exactly as designed. Governments borrow forever. Taxpayers fund the interest. Institutions collect it. And the principal is never repaid. That isn't an accident or a mistake. It's the world's most profitable system. If you understand that, you understand how modern power operates.